When you hear the word Ghana, your first thought is likely to be the modern-day country of that name. However, when the Republic of Ghana adopted that name in 1957 upon its declaration of independence from Great Britain, it wasn't drawing from its own history. Rather, the representatives of the three constituent colonies which formed the nation, each with their own distinct ethnic groups, cultures, and histories, looked back to the distant past for a name they could all unite under. This was the name of the Ghana Empire, a great West African empire with origins in antiquity. In this video, we'll explore the history of the Empire of Ghana, or as they would have called themselves, Ouagadou. The Empire of Wagadu, located mostly in what is now western Mali and southeastern Mauritania, is possibly the earliest West African empire we know by name, most likely founded in the 3rd or 4th century CE. At the peak of its strength from the 9th to 11th century CE, Ouagadou held authority from the lower Senegal River in the west to the bend of the Niger River in the east, and served as a major trading power in the surrounding region. There's a lot we don't know for sure about Ouagadou, as they left no written records of their own. However, oral traditions from the surrounding regions, archaeology, and sources written by Arab contemporaries who often interacted with Ouagadou commercially or diplomatically all give us glimpses into this powerful state. One of the royal titles of the Emperor of Ouagadou was Ghana, probably meaning war king. In Arab sources, states were commonly referred to either by the name of their capital, the name of their people, or the name of their ruler, and in this case it was the latter, hence why many people now know Ouagadou as the Ghana Empire. Ouagadou was situated within a region called the Sahel, a transitional zone between the vast desert of the Sahara and the forest zone of the West African coast. The Sahel isn't too shabby of a spot to set up shop. Consisting mostly of savanna, with more trees as you get further south and fewer as you go north, this area is fairly well situated for rearing grazing livestock like cattle and goats. Additionally, the area is crossed by several major rivers and many smaller tributaries, allowing for irrigation, fishing, and riverine navigation. Today, much of Ouagadou's territory lies within the Sahara due to the expansion of the desert, but this is only because the desert has been gradually growing for the past few thousand years. At the time of the empire, there were more inland waterways stretching through this area and greener conditions. These conditions had allowed the Western Sahel to develop agriculture independently by no later than 3500 BCE, possibly closer to 6000 BCE. The area also had a long-standing pastoralist tradition, with complex cattle-rearing cultures present from about 4000 BCE, and an urban tradition going back to the Tichit culture of 2200 BCE. Unfortunately, we don't know much about this period due to a combination of the lack of writing in West Africa and the surrounding regions at the time, and relatively limited archaeological attention. But that background provides context for the eventual emergence of Ouagadou. We don't know exactly when Ouagadou was founded. It's possible that it was founded close to the time it was first recorded in Arabic sources in 773 CE, but most scholars place the date of founding between 200 and 500 CE, based on a combination of archaeological data and the Arab claim that 22 kings ruled over the empire prior to the foundations of Islam. The reasons for Ouagadou's expansion lay in new trade connections which were beginning to develop around 300 CE, enabled by the recent introduction of camels to the Sahara. Ouagadou's location in the Sahel put it in a perfect position to profit off of trade. See, the desert in the north was home to salt flats, as well as to caravans plugged into broader trade routes linking North Africa up to West Asia, Europe, and indirectly to more distant regions. In the south, meanwhile, you had several major sources of gold in the vaguely defined area of Ouagadou. For this gold to get into the Saharan trade networks, it needed to be carried several hundred kilometers by donkey to Ouagadou, where it could then be traded for salt, a vital resource not only for flavoring and preserving food, but for human survival. The gold miners wanted that salt, and the caravans wanted gold. Ouagadou used its powerful military to expand across a large stretch of the intermediary region, allowing them to monopolize the trade between them. With this, they grew incredibly wealthy off of tariffs and purchases made by traveling merchants as they stopped in to participate in the salt gold trade, as well as to trade for other goods like silk, beads, ivory, animal hides, copper, and enslaved people. Goods, or at least salt and gold, were taxed both when entering the empire and when leaving it, so the king profited off of visiting merchants whether they came to buy or sell. The king also became wealthy off of local gold mining. While miners were able to keep the gold dust they retrieved, any nuggets were turned over to the king, whose personal fortunes grew vast through this practice. By around 800, Arab sources began to refer to Ouagadou as the Land of Gold, and in 977 the Arab writer Ibn Hawqal wrote that the king of Ouagadou was the richest on earth because of his gold. Our understanding of how Ouagadou was governed is fairly vague, but the Arabic sources do give us some hints. Writing in 889 or 890, al-Yaqubi stated that the emperor was very powerful, and that under his authority are a number of kings, telling us that the empire most likely included many vassal states. Al-Bakri gives us further details when describing the Ghana's court.
He sits in audience or to hear grievances against officials in a domed pavilion around which stand 10 horses covered with gold-embroidered materials. Behind the king stand 10 pages holding shields and swords decorated with gold, and on his right are the sons of the kings of his country wearing splendid garments and their hair plated with gold. The governor of the city sits on the ground before the king, and around him are ministers seated likewise. At the door of the pavilion are dogs of excellent pedigree that hardly ever leave the place where the king is, guarding him. Around their necks they wear collars of gold and silver, studded with a number of balls of the same metals.
In this quote, we can perhaps see how the Ghana kept his vassals in line. The presence of the sons of lesser kings resembles practices seen in states such as the Roman, Inca, and Ottoman empires, where the rulers of conquered people were often made to send their sons to the capital, so that they could either be used as leverage to ensure compliance, or raised to be useful puppets to the empire. In Ouagadou's case, it was most likely the former, as the empire and presumably many of its neighbors operated on a system of matrilineal patriarchy, where rather than kings being succeeded by their own sons, they would be succeeded by the sons of their sisters. Al-Bakri tells us that the capital of Ouagadou was actually made up of 2 large towns 6 miles apart from each other, connected by a continuously inhabited area. One of these towns was inhabited by Muslims, and was described as being large and possessing 12 mosques, as well as having salaried imams, muezzins, jurists, and scholars. He labels the other town as the King's Town, and gives its name as al-Ghaba, meaning the forest in Arabic. He states that this town contained 1 mosque for the Muslims arriving in the king's court to pray at, as well as many domed buildings and enclosed groves with religious significance, in which the king's prisons were also contained. Based on later sources, it is generally believed that the capital of Ghana was the city of Kumbi Saleh. This is never directly stated in any of our sources, but can be pieced together from a few bits of evidence. The 17th to 19th century Tarikh al-Fatash claims that the Mali Empire was preceded by the Kaya Maga dynasty, ruling from Kumbi. Kaya Maga sounds an awful lot like Kaya Magan, meaning Lord of Gold, another known title for kings of Ouagadou. Another 17th century text, the Tarikh al-Sudan, makes a similar claim, but refers to the capital of the Kaya Maga dynasty as the city of Ghana, a term frequently used for the capital of Ouagadou in earlier sources as well. Taken together, these make it seem awfully probable that these sources are referring to the Ouagadou Empire, and that the city of Ghana and Kumbi were therefore one and the same. However, it isn't conclusive, and some scholars question this identification. The Bambara Epic of Sumanguru Kante identifies Kumbi and Ouagadou as 2 different entities, and as of yet, we haven't found any sites matching the description of the king's town of Al-Ghaba, with its many burial mounds and domed buildings. Additionally, some of the Arab accounts give contradictory information about the capital city. For example, in the 12th century, al-Idrisi described the capital of Ouagadou as being positioned on a riverbank, on a hill that would become an island when the river flooded. This doesn't remotely match with the details of Kumbi Saleh, but it's possible that al-Idrisi was presenting his own assumptions as fact, mixing up the capital of Ouagadou with some other city, or that by his time the capital had been moved. This latter possibility is supported by another of al-Idrisi's claims, that the royal palace was built in 1116 or 1117 CE. With this in mind, we can say that Ouagadou's capital may not have always been Kumbi Saleh, but that Kumbi Saleh is a decent candidate for one capital of Ouagadou. Several archaeological digs have been performed at Kumbi Saleh, and while nothing has been found to conclusively identify it as the capital of Ouagadou, certain details certainly line up with Arab accounts. Carbon dating suggests that the town was occupied from the 9th to the 14th centuries, and while that range is a bit late for Ouagadou as a whole, it makes sense for the Muslim town. Archaeologists have yet to find any sites that can be identified with al-Ghaba, so if Kumbi Saleh was part of the capital, it makes sense that it would be the Muslim section specifically. Al-Bakri describes the capital as being located on a plain, which more or less matches Kumbi Saleh. The main section of the town is slightly elevated, but overall, the area is quite flat. In contrast to the territory a bit further south, this part of the Sahel has local stone deposits. So rather than the mud brick architecture characteristic of Mali and Songhai, in the upper section of Kumbi, the houses were mostly made of stones bound together with adobe. This lines up with al-Bakri's description of the houses in this area being made of stone. Based on the amount of debris, it's likely that some of these buildings had multiple stories, though their rooms were fairly narrow. The city was quite dense, with only narrow streets separating most buildings, except for a wide avenue running east to west through the center of town. A large mosque has been found in a central position in this avenue, while the western end of the main avenue opens up into an area believed to have served as a marketplace. The southwest seems to have been largely reserved for more temporary structures, with only a few stone buildings. The upper section of the city was roughly 700 by 700 meters, while the lower section in the southwest was roughly 500 by 700 meters. It's been estimated that the town housed about 15 to 20,000 people, a very large population for a Saharan town, though given the wetter conditions of the time, the many wells of the area were apparently enough to supply them. Wells aren't exactly the most unusual characteristic, but I will note that al-Bakri drew specific attention to the wells of the Muslim town of the capital, which he said provided sweet water. 2 large cemeteries have been found outside of the city, and there's one prominent monumental tomb with large pillars, which contains 3 coffins made of shale slabs, all unfortunately broken into prior to excavations. This tomb closely resembles certain Amazigh tombs from the northern Sahara, which makes a lot of sense if we assume that many of the Muslims who settled in this region would have come across the Sahara with trade caravans. However, it also bears resemblance to the tumuli tombs al-Bakri described the kings of Ouagadou being buried in, pointing to a blend of local and foreign influences in the tomb's construction. Many stone plaques bearing Quranic inscriptions have also been found at the site, attesting to the Islamic influence on this town, though these artifacts may date to after the time of Ouagadou. The religious makeup of Ouagadou changed over time. In our earliest sources, Ouagadou was unsurprisingly associated with a local form of paganism, seemingly with animistic elements. We might know a little bit about the mythology of this religion based on later Soninke oral traditions. According to one version of one of these narratives, the prosperity of Ouagadou was granted by the mystical, 7-headed serpent Bida, who would bring agricultural abundance and cause it to rain gold nuggets in exchange for the annual sacrifice of a young girl. One year, the girl chosen for sacrifice was rescued by her fiancé, who slew the serpent. Before he died, the serpent cursed the land, bringing about the downfall of Ouagadou. It's possible that this myth could in some way reflect religious beliefs in Ouagadou, as Arab accounts report the worship of mystical snakes in a nearby society. Serpent worship also appears in several native religions from farther south, and while we can't assume any connection, it's not out of the question that worship of snakes could be a feature of ancestral Niger-Congo religion, ancestral to the religions of both the Forest Kingdoms and Ouagadou. The motif of a giant serpent which demands sacrifice being slain also appears as a possible allegory for the conversion of a society to Islam in a House of Founding legend, and something similar could be going on here, considering the common associations between Ouagadou's conversion to Islam and its fall, which we'll talk about more later. This is all entirely speculative though. We have no idea how recently this story was composed, or whether it drew at all from classical Soninke culture. Most of what we can confidently say about Ouagadou's original religion is therefore confined to practices rather than beliefs. Several Arab sources make references to idol worship, so chances are that the people of Ouagadou would represent gods or spirits in sculptures or carvings. Al-Bakri further tells us that
around the king's town are domed buildings and groves and thickets where the sorcerers of these people, men in charge of the religious cult, live. In them too are their idols and the tombs of their kings. These woods are guarded, and none may enter them and know what is there.
Al-Bakri also provides some further information on royal burial practices.
When their king dies, they construct over the place where his tomb will be an enormous dome of sagewood. When they bring him on a bed covered with a few carpets and cushions and place him beside the dome. At his side they place his ornaments, his weapons, and the vessels from which he used to eat and drink, filled with various kinds of food and beverages. They place there too the men who used to serve his meals. They close the door of the dome and cover it with mats and furnishings. Then the people assemble, who heap earth upon it until it becomes like a big hillock and dig a ditch around it until the mound can be reached only at one place.
Christopher Ehret argues that, while much of Ouagadou's culture was Niger-Congo in origin and connected to practices from further south, the practice of bearing attendance with the king was part of a Sudanic sacral tradition, likely introduced into Ouagadou's culture through contact with the Songhai people of Gao. By the time of al-Bakri's writings, around 1068, Wagadu also had a prominent Muslim population. In addition to the previously discussed subdivision of the capital dedicated entirely to Muslim inhabitants, al-Bakri tells us that the king's interpreters, the official in charge of his treasury, and the majority of his ministers were all Muslim. We also see the application of different expectations based on religion. While among the followers of the king's religion, only the king and his heir were allowed to wear sewn clothes, this rule did not apply to Muslims, and followers of the king's religion knelt down and sprinkled dust on their heads when coming before the king, where Muslims simply greeted him by clapping their hands. Al-Bakri's mention of the large number of Muslims among the king's officials serves to illustrate the increasing influence of Muslims in the royal court of 11th century Ouagadou, and shortly after al-Bakri's time, the Rana himself would convert to Islam. Writing in 1154, al-Idrisi regarded the country as Islamic, although we can assume there was still some pagan presence. Al-Zūhri further regarded Ghana as a Muslim country around the same time, stating,
"They turned Muslim in the days of Lamtuna, and their Islam is good. Today, they are Muslims, and have scholars, lawyers, and Quran readers, and have become preeminent in their fields. Some of their chief leaders have come to Al-Andalus. They have traveled to Mecca, and made the pilgrimage, and visited the Prophet's tomb, and returned to their land to spend large sums on the jihad."
It's most probable that the growing prominence of Islam in Ouagadou society was largely a result of their trading connections across the Sahara, as well as to surrounding Sahelian states with large Muslim presences, such as the Kingdom of Takrur in modern Senegal, a possible vassal state of Ouagadou which had converted to Islam in the 1030s, and the Kingdom of Kawkaw, a neighboring power seated in what would become Gao. Connections to Islamic trading partners would have brought Muslim migrants and ideas into Ouagadou from as early as the 8th century, with various people within the empire embracing the faith either due to genuine belief or in the hopes of securing better trading relationships. However, there's one more factor that is often associated with the conversion of Ouagadou to Islam, as well as the empire's fall. Around the 1030s, a new religious movement emerged among the Amazigh people of the western Maghreb. These were the Almoravids, who held to a strict form of Islam. After winning over the Sanhaja Amazigh in the 1050s, they formed an Almoravid dynasty, and launched campaigns to weed out the more lax forms of Islam they saw around them. They captured the major trading city of Al-Daghoust, which had long had close relations with Ouagadou, in 1055, placing their southern border up against Ouagadou. Additionally, they formed an alliance with the Kingdom of Takrur, whose king was sympathetic to their strict interpretation of Islam. According to Arab historical accounts, the Almoravids managed to conquer Ouagadou's capital in 1076 after a decade-long struggle. This conquest was credited with sending Ouagadou into a decline which would end with its eventual conquest by other West African powers. However, some scholars have argued that it's a mistake to take this narrative at face value. In their 1982 article, The Conquest That Never Was, David Conrad and Humphrey Fisher argue that no Arabic sources unambiguously and reliably detail a conquest of Ouagadou, instead largely providing vague or questionable accounts. As they point out, most Arabic sources which reference an Almoravid conquest were written centuries after the fact. The primary account of the supposed conquest comes from al-Zūhri, writing in the mid-12th century, around 80 years after the period in question, and in addition to getting some details wrong, flipping 2 digits of the date and possibly misidentifying the Almoravid leader's tribe of origin, for example, he actually never explicitly mentions a conquest. Speaking of Ouagadou, al-Zūhri stated,
"The people of this country professed paganism until the year 469, when Yahya bin Abi Bakr, the Emir of Masufa, made his appearance."
No mention of an actual conquest in this early account, just an appearance. Later, al-Zūhri gives some more details about the presence of Almoravids in the territory of Ouagadou, but the terms he uses can be interpreted in contradictory ways, either as the Almoravids ruling over Ouagadou or being subservient to it. The first explicit mention of a conquest doesn't come until al-Makrizi, writing in the late 14th to early 15th century. Conrad and Fisher also point out that, despite later Arab authors pointing to the Almoravid invasion as sparking a major decline in Ouagadou's prosperity, in the work of al-Idrisi, no indication is presented that the Ouagadou of his time had declined since the time of al-Bakri. Indeed, he noted the capital city as the most prosperous in the Sahel. Al-Zūhri also wrote that Ouagadou called on the Almoravids for military aid against their rivals in Tarimaka, which sounds a lot more like Ouagadou as an independent ally of the Almoravids, rather than a subject state. Along with these textual points, other scholars have pointed to a lack of archaeological evidence of any major violence or rupture in Kumbi Saleh at the supposed time of the conquest, casting further doubt on its historicity. However, other scholars such as Cheryl Burkhalter have pushed back against these arguments with their own textual analysis, and as we've already discussed, Kumbi Saleh may not even have been the capital of Ouagadou, so the lack of signs of conquest there doesn't necessarily prove anything. Amira Benison has argued that we simply don't have enough evidence to say for certain what happened. Overall then, we can certainly not rule out the possibility of an Almoravid conquest of Ouagadou, but we also probably shouldn't accept it as established fact. It may instead be the case that the Almoravids influenced Ouagadou religiously, but not militarily, perhaps motivating the conversion of the king to Islam, but not necessarily subordinating him. Given the fact that, as we've discussed, Ouagadou already had a strong Islamic presence in both the general population and the government, an Almoravid invasion is certainly not necessary for explaining how the empire became Islamic. Add to this the fact that al-Zūhri claimed that Tarimaka turned Muslim after their conflict against Ouagadou and their Almoravid allies, despite the fact that they'd already been Muslim prior, and it doesn't seem like too much of a leap to suggest that becoming Muslim therefore refers to an adoption of Almoravid doctrine in both cases. Additionally, we can't uncritically accept that Almoravid influence, military or otherwise, resulted in the decline of Ouagadou, as this supposed decline was only noted well after 1076. Regardless of whether or not it had anything to do with the Almoravids, Ouagadou certainly did begin waning in power after that period. Aside from potential conflict with the Amazigh states to the north, Ouagadou experienced environmental issues as the Sahara continued to dry, resulting in less water for crops, livestock, and people. It's likely that Ouagadou's core territories experienced marked population decline as people resettled further south, and with a declining population, the empire lost its hold on outlying territories. In the 11th century, the kingdom of Soso began rising to prominence to Ouagadou's south. In addition to controlling many of the major gold mines in this area, Soso's lands included major iron-producing areas, and a diverse range of environments including Sahelian woodland savanna, mountainous territory with pastures and farmland, and rainforest lands in the south. This diversity put Soso in a strong economic position, bolstered by the kingdom's reputation for producing fine cotton cloth. Being further south, Soso was unaffected by the desertification impacting Ouagadou, and with its advantageous economic position, Soso seemingly rose to take Ouagadou's place as the strongest power of the Western Sahara from the 12th century. At its height, the Soso Empire had conquered much of Ouagadou's territory, seemingly reducing the Ghana to vassalage based on the writings of Ibn Khaldun and Malian oral history. According to the Epic of Sunjata, a semi-mythical oral narrative about the founding of the Mali Empire, Soso would be defeated by Malian forces sometime in the early to mid-13th century. The Ghana would for a time be a subordinate king within the Mali Empire, before disappearing from records. With this, the Ouagadou Empire was well and truly gone, replaced by its better-known successor, the Empire of Mali. There's still much we don't know about Ouagadou. Some things have yet to be uncovered, and others will simply never be known. However, what we do know makes Ouagadou a fascinating state with massive significance to the history of West Africa. It was the first known empire to take advantage of a position in the Western Sahel to grow prosperous off of the salt gold trade, but not the last, with the empires of Soso, Mali, and Songhai each in turn following the same path. Mali is among Africa's best-known empires, in large part due to the vast wealth of their kings, but those kings gained their wealth by following the playbook of Ouagadou's kings, the Lords of Gold. With Ouagadou's power, antiquity, and relevance to African history as a whole, it's no surprise that in 1957 the former Gold Coast colonies would choose to unite under the name of Ghana. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed the video, please consider sharing it around so that more people can learn about this fascinating empire. If you want to see some more African history from me, consider checking out my video on the Kingdom of Benin next. And don't forget to check out the rest of the Untold Black History playlist, linked below. I've been Soma, and I'll see you next time.
Do